I just was thinking back on how Daniel and I got to be friends many years ago. We were both students at UCSF. I was a science grad student, Daniel was a medical student, and I remember he was telling me that he was working on a novel. I thought, oh, well, we'll see what happens with that. And now here we are. He somehow managed to continue on the path of becoming a doctor and also becoming a novelist, whereas I switched out of being a scientist and became a full-time journalist. Anyway, it's sort of fun to reconnect in this context so many years later, and I hope we do get a chance to talk about science in this book, since that's sort of how I got to know you in the context of medical school, I suppose.
Yeah.
I thought maybe we would start by having you read a short selection from the book.
Sure. It is great. It's the first time I think we've ever talked over, I don't even know if I call this Zoom, CrowdCast. And I see from a little number on the screen that there are other people in the room, but these houses have this strange sort of sense of both intimacy and then also the great void of the internet beyond this space. So I'm here in California and you're in New York. Also, I don't know, I recognize some familiar names on the guest list. So hello to some old and new friends. And it seems like people are pretty scattered around the world as well, which I guess is a nice aspect of these virtual events. So we talked about some sections that possibly read to start things out. And I thought that I would read from the second story in the book. So this is the book is a collection of short stories that share a common theme of crisis and epiphany. Some of the characters are real historical characters. Some of these characters are fictional characters. And this happens to come from the second story of the book that's about a true historical character, a name probably familiar to most people, Alfred Russel Wallace. The story is called The Ecstasy of Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace, as folks might know, sort of co-discovered evolution, or at least proposed the natural selection as a driving force for evolution alongside Charles Darwin. He's a very different person, Darwin having been brought up very much within the establishment, whereas Wallace was sort of self-educated man who began really as just a collector who traveled the world. It was called a species man, or traveling around the world collecting objects and sending them back to museums and essentially paying his way that way. And so with this story, I was curious about the moment in which, unlike Darwin, who takes famously decades to come up with his theory, Wallace, the myth goes, sort of discovers it overnight. And I was interested in that moment. So I just thought that I would begin with this moment of epiphany for this collection of epiphanies. Later, back among Englishmen, he would say it came to him in a fit of fever. For months he'd been traveling like a nomad through the shattered volcanoes of the archipelago. Celebes, Sarawak, Kalimantan. Monsoons greeted his arrivals. In Singapore, he peered into the great cauldrons of American whalers. On Borneo, he shot orangs. His boat needed only to touch shore and he would vanish into the jungles with his net in hand. He traveled as he always did, without rest, driven by the constant fear that there were species he would miss, forms and colors he would never know. Racked by chills, thin, exhausted, he could scarcely remain upright for the entirety of his meals. Yet in the field he moved with the same alacrity as he did during his childhood days, gathering windfall from his neighbors' apple trees, powered not by physical strength, but by a momentum of mind, movement driven by movement itself, by the sun and heat and cold on his neck, by his astonishment at the natural world unfolding. From life at sea, he had acquired the habit of rising early. From the rivers and countless portages, the conviction that one does not own what one can't carry. In moments of reverie, he imagined his body light of all but the clothes on his back and the exquisite catalog of his mind. He was 34. To his mother, he wrote, "I am running out of time." Bug collector, species man. It was fitting, perhaps, that the first fateful communication from Darwin came as a simple request for specimens of Malay domestic fowl. When that letter arrived, addressed from Down House, he couldn't believe that it was real. Surely, he thought, it must be a prank played on him by a friend. It was only 2 years before the day that would forever link his name to Darwin's, and yet it was beyond his wildest fantasies to think of him as a correspondent. He wasn't 20 when he first read The Voyage of the Beagle, and for his entire life, when he thought of its author, he found himself a gangly, bare-chinned boy again. He had read all the great man's works on barnacles. He sent both a domesticated duck and a wild type from which the domesticated breed derived. And in a fit of boldness, he included musings on a question that had begun to occupy him, namely the appearance of variations among species, about which he had written a single essay, penned on Sarawak, published in the Annals, and generally ignored. When at last, in Makassar, after months in the jungle, he received Darwin's reply, he opened it on the docks. His hand trembled as he read over and over again. "I can plainly see that we have thought much alike and to a certain extent have come to similar conclusions." Tears sprung to his eyes. Again he read it, then folded it away and began to walk back to the shore, stopping 10 yards later to check his pocket and assure himself that it was there. "I can plainly see that we have thought much alike and to a certain extent have come to similar conclusions." Did he recognize that the letter contained not only praise but a veiled intimidation? "This summer will make the 20th year since I opened my first notebook on the question of how and in what way do species and varieties differ from each other," Darwin had written. "I am now preparing my work for publication." But if there was a warning in these words, it was one he didn't notice. It was impossible that someone so great could see a bare-chinned boy as threatening. Or perhaps, forever a traveler in another's country, he had known too much kindness from the strangers in his life. And so in Makassar inspired, he wandered. Among the black macaques, the flapping hornbills, the wheeling ornithoptera with satin yellow wings. From rotting jackfruits, he scraped beetles for his collections. At the edge of the rugged territory of the Bugis, he watched rivers disappear into the earth. Brown snakes tangled in his net as he ruffled through the leaves impatiently, imagining what he could find for Darwin. It was summer. He sweated, bent his spectacles so they wouldn't slip from his nose. Bug collector, species man, and yet by now in the patterns of the insects that he pushed pin by pin into his boxes, something greater had begun to reveal itself to him, though what it was he didn't know. He felt as he did when walking through the jungle, he sensed the presence of another creature following in the understory, a presence that vanished when he turned to look. At night, he began to dream of a generating machine, a clanking, screeching engine in which old species were devoured and from which new ones emerged, blinking into the light. And I'll stop there.
So you described a theme of the book as being crises and epiphanies. And so that was in my head as you were reading epiphanies. It is weird to think about Darwin and Wallace and a moment of discovery of something that is, the opposite of a moment of change over the extremely long term. It made me wonder, just to take it to just a very different level, when you say the book is when your theory of the book is that it's about crises and epiphanies, is that based on your observations of the stories that you've written, or did you set out to write about something that's quite interesting to you, crises and epiphanies, and you ended up with these 9 stories?
I didn't set out to write it. So I think what happened was that I wrote maybe 2 or 3 stories, and the people that I was interested in writing portraits, and there I think so. There's sort of like a long tradition of lives collections, and one that I had read around the time this was started was Borges wrote early book, maybe the first book by Borges called A Brief History of Iniquity, which was a series of sort of these biographies. And I love the way that they encapsulated lives in just these few short pages. And so the first few stories were lives stories. And I noticed that the people that I was interested in were people who were facing this moment and sort of seeing the world either very clearly or the world kind of very clearly coming apart. And I think probably it was around the time of the third story that as I was writing short stories, it felt like certain ones belonged in this and other ones didn't. And so, so as they kind of came along into the world out of whatever, kind of, to use a phrase of Wallace, I guess, generating machine, that they made themselves available for this collection, I could say.
And are they, when you say the first three, you mean the first three stories that you wrote, not the first three in the book?
Right. They didn't come, the ordering came later once I sort of saw what I had. So the first story that I wrote in the collection is the last story in the book. That gives the title, that gives it collection. And then I think maybe the first two were early, and then they tend to move a little bit more modern as time goes on, but they jump back and forth in history.
Only one of them is set in the present day, is that right?
Right. So there's one that's set in the current day about a person who is thinking back on his uncle, who is a Civil War reenactor. Even that story takes place mostly in like the 70s and 80s. But for me, that's very recent. It feels very modern.
Do you have a particular reason why you don't want to write about the 90s or aughts?
Well, the 90s or aughts. There's a couple of scenes from the 90s and the aughts in this. I like to writing. There's something very refreshing about writing that, because I was able to draw from the material world of my childhood, which was like this, was like time traveling through my own memory instead of sort of scouring other landscapes. And so, like I got to write about. I mean, I grew up watching with friends and family World Wrestling Federation wrestling. I thought that was sort of the high point of popular entertainment. But never thought of it at all as a kind of place to sort of plumb what it is to be American or belonging, or all the ideas that it gave forth. But even thinking about the kinds of cars that we drove or the televisions that we used, that was actually kind of a great joy to work on with that story. To think of the material world in the same way I might think of the material world of Victorian England, say. More recent's hard for me. I always find it hard. I mean, recently I've been trying to write books set very much in the present era, and short stories, I should say, set in the present era. And there's always this question that it's. I think I find it easier to come at something from a different direction, from sort of a slant, so that maybe I can say what I want to say about something that's going on today, but I don't feel quite as self-conscious as if I'm trying to sort of tell other people what to think. Writing about the past in a way has sort of a quality of sort of making available something that also happened that may perhaps bear on what's going on.
So you feel less self-conscious when you're writing about the past?
Much less self-conscious when I'm writing about the past.
Mm-hmm. So in the Wallace story, I mean, even the passage you just read, there's snippets of Darwin's letter to Wallace and Wallace's letter to his mother. Certainly, I mean, I didn't look any of these things up, but certainly one gets the sense in reading it that this is a meticulously researched story, that those are slips of primary source material that you've put into the piece. Is that true?
Yeah. So I mean, any of the stories that are about real people make use as much as possible of the historical record. And in this case, as I was reading it just right now, I actually found myself thinking, for example, the term generating machine. I don't think that was a term of his, but I don't think it was. But I found myself wondering about it. But certainly the letters are from Darwin's, and in fact, the letters, there's one of them is a little agrammatical, and I remember going through with the copy editor about whether or not actually this was correct or a mistake had been made, and making the decision to kind of include the way that Darwin had written there. that, like, if it serves the story, I very much want to use it, and all of the details of what he finds and what he sees and the animals that he collects, those are real, and that, I mean, that I could have made up. He collects thousands of animals and plants and insects. Actually, the page that I ended up stopping on includes half the rest of the page is just a list of the number of the species that he collected, which I found like so poetic in itself, that I had to include. I mean, butterflies, 620 species, moth, 2,000 species, beetles, 3,700. I mean, 3,700 species. It's like amazing. So that's real. That's from the Malay archipelago, but then the rest, psychologically, what's going on in Wallace's mind, that's invented. Like any sort of good Victorian, he's quite hushed about his own personal life and his own emotional life, and so that's kept like completely out of his memoirs, as was Darwin. I mean, I only learned recently that in the course of all of this, so Wallace, the way the story goes is Wallace first sends this letter describing variation to Darwin. Darwin's kind of interested, this guy's interested in the same sort of stuff. They develop a little bit of a correspondence, and then Wallace has this epiphany that it's natural selection which is driving evolution, causing certain species to die and others to selectively live. And so he writes this apparently in like a fit of malarial fever, and he sends it off to Darwin. He doesn't hear from Darwin then for months, doesn't know what's going on. And what happened was that Darwin had been working on this and for decades, and then Wallace's story arrives, and Darwin realizes that he's been scooped. And so the famous story goes, he shows the letter to some of his other famous scientist friends, and they all try to put their heads together to figure out what to do because this other guy beat him to it. Missing from this whole narrative is the fact that in the course of this, Darwin loses a son. One of his children dies, and so he writes of all this sort of turmoil that's going on, but the sort of the official correspondence is about like the turmoil that happens with him losing this race to publication, and even that seems sort of like a great bearing of the soul. Of course, I think the real tragedy goes unmentioned in these narratives.
It must be so annoying if you've been working on something for 20 years and then some jerk has an epiphany,
right?
And all of a sudden is caught up to you. To bring it back to epiphanies. So when you're making up Wallace largely, right? His interior life. Are you making up the Wallace that you think, is probably the Wallace, is as likely to be the real Wallace as any other? Is the Wallace that you wish were the real Wallace? I guess I'm curious what your what the target is of the creation. If you're sort of drawing from an imagined life, or you're just creating from scratch with no care to what you think the real life might have been.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fiction. So I think that his story is in the service of fiction, of the creation of a Wallace. Like the goal isn't a kind of reproduction. Were he to read the story, that fantastic event would, right? But I've thought of that, like if he read the story, what would he think? And is the goal for him to think like, hey, you got it, like that was what was going on? I don't think so. I think that it's to use this sort of famous story that kind of exists in our historical scientific consciousness, to use it to explore something else, which, in this case is marvel at the natural world, and originally was sort of about scientific epiphany. I think now, as I read it again and as time has gone on, what I appreciate more and more about him is that he truly has this sort of ecstatic, awe-filled view of nature, and one gets the sense of that reading his books. It's just this person who remains wide-eyed his entire life, walking through the forests, and that's like a consciousness that I was interested in exploring.
So one of the things that comes up in this story, and I think in a number of the stories, is kind of there's someone who makes some scientific type of discovery, and then they interact with the scientific establishment. So in this story, it's Wallace out from wherever he is, writing to Darwin in England. There's another story about a balloonist in France who makes some, fantastic observation while on a flight, and then presents to the I forget what it is, the French Academy of Sciences or something, and was ridiculed. There's one, in the form of a letter from a country doctor to his big city colleagues, as I understood it, describing his own symptoms, trying to self-diagnose, but hoping for help. So there is, and then the title story in the collection is about an outsider artist. So there's this. I mean, that's one where it's not a scientist, but there's kind of, it seems like the narrators or main characters are often outsiders making discoveries that they are then presenting to the inside unsuccessfully. That's which is a complication on just mere epiphany. It's like stifled epiphany, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great observation. As I think through it, they're all kind of outsiders. I think that the outsider makes for sort of a natural subject. Not to say that I think that someone, sort of the gray-haired secretary, say, who has been doing the same thing his entire life and holds the keys to the national publications, and would also be kind of an interesting character to sort of explore and think about. But I think if the stories were sort of portraits of people kind of in a moment of rupture, there had to be either sort of a fall or an elevation. And I guess if I think of most of them, they're sort of mostly elevation, people kind of torn out of their lives and placed in the awareness of something which they regularly wouldn't have had, and then sort of exploration of what happens to them in that moment.
Since you brought up being torn out of one's life, do you want to read? There's another passage we talked about from the other doctor's service, if I have the name of the story.
Sure.
It's a little long, but that's a short one. Maybe this is a good time to listen to that.
Can you remind me the page of this one? Sorry.
Sure. 1 second. That is on page 82.
Okay. So this is a story called The Second Doctor's Service, which begins as a letter by this country doctor, like you mentioned, to a medical society, asking for help with a condition that he's begun to observe in himself. And I'll begin just on the second page. He begins with sort of a standard formal introduction of the time before he goes on to describe. Unlike with most illnesses, sir, which rise within us insidiously, creeping through vein and fiber, unsettling our slumber, gradually awakening with us that ineffable, horrific sense of dis-ease, it's possible to state the very instant, indeed the very longitude and latitude of my affliction, being 4 strokes after 12 noon on August the 24th, 1882, on the cusp of Mercy's Ridge outside of S. I was returning from a sick call. The patient was a parson's son who had fallen ill with a tertian fever. I had attended to him for 3 days and nights with the constant applications of Beadham's ointment, and upon restoring him to health, had saddled my horse and begun my journey home. It was a warm summer day, one of those particularly gilded morrows when the air swarms with motes of pollen and the scent of wet grass rises from the fields, and everywhere life appears to swirl in such a miasma that I have wondered since if I did not inhale some invisible animalcule as I galloped up the hill, and that it is perhaps upon this beastie that I should lay the blame for all that followed. Down in the valley, the noon bells had tolled thrice, when there arose a very strong odor of chestnuts, overwhelming the sweet scent of the grass and the sharp bloom of all the goldenrods stirred up by my horse's feet. This was impossible, of course. Chestnuts would not be in season until November, and this thought, delivered whole and instantaneously between the 3rd and 4th tolling of the bells, seemed to carry on its wings the conviction that something odd and terrible was to occur. It was then, just as I crested the hill, expecting the spectacular vision of the forests below, that I found myself not before that view, but somehow 5 miles further, thundering over the bridge at Wilson's Mill. We are all accustomed, I believe, to the experience of traveling and drifting into distraction, only to arrive safely at our destination, as if directed by some unseen hand. My first suspicion was that this was what had happened, and yet I also knew it wasn't so. I had passed along this road 1,000 times, and not once had I failed to stop on its descent into that ancient forest of beech and linden, where the soft light filters down through the whispering leaves, and the air is filled with the gay tintinnabulation of the chickadees, and the odor of the mushrooms and mosses never fails to awaken in me a profound nostalgia for my childhood adventures amidst those cathedrals of fallen boughs. Nor I knew, could have I fallen asleep, for the road is too perilous, with hanging limbs that can dispatch even the most alert traveler. Such is my reasoning in retrospect. At the time, it was a particular sensation that told me something was different, a feeling, unlike any other I'd experienced, of complete nothingness, as if an ellipsis had occurred between the fields of goldenrod on Mercy's Ridge and the linden depths of the mill, as if time and distance had somehow folded upon themselves, or, to put it differently, as if I had simply ceased to be. This is first attack.
One of the things I love about that story and that passage is one of the things I love about many of the stories is the way you describe the efforts that people take to to apply a framework of reason to their own experience or to their observations, and the way that can lead to some kind of discovery, but also failure. I mean, when he kind of gets lost in the odor of the mushrooms, even as he's trying to be so precise about it was between the third and fourth tolling of the bell, city colleagues.
Right.
But I mean, all of that made me think about your other job. I mean, you're a psychiatrist. You are, I guess, I would imagine, I don't know what a psychiatrist does exactly, but I would imagine you're recording the tolling of bells in one way or another. And you're hearing a lot of very specific subjective experiences and then just, slotting things into categories. You're taxonomizing like Wallace and Darwin and forming theories of people. So I guess when I was reading this story about Dr. Service, I thought, oh, Daniel's the big city colleague, and this is one of his patients. All of which is my really roundabout way of asking you, when you're writing this story in particular, because this is so much about someone who is describing some kind of bizarre psychiatric type symptom, right? Are you thinking of your patients? Do you identify with Dr. Service? Do you identify him with people you've come across in your work?
Well, so he in particular comes from a case report. The story is inspired by his case report, 19th century case report, of a certain kind of seizure. And so there is this interest. When you talk about taxonomy, what's really fascinating about being in psychiatry is this imperfect science, like much of medicine is imperfect science, but psychiatry still lacks the use of the kinds of lab tests and imaging studies say that other areas of medicine have. And so I think it's subject to kind of constant reorganization on a level that probably other fields don't go through, or at least don't go through so sort of publicly and dramatically. And looking in psychiatry, the fascinating parts about looking at the history of psychiatry is how people divide up the world and divide up human experience in totally different ways. And so there was this period of time where everybody who had a sudden change or kind of convulsive experience was sort of lumped together as perhaps having the same sort of thing. So maybe someone who developed mania sort of what we think of more in a psychiatric category today, would be thought of having a similar condition to somebody who's having like a seizure, which we think of maybe more in neurologic category today. And there are other like fits that we maybe associate more with a stroke. Or, there was this like idea that there were these kind of convulsive, repetitive illnesses that people suffered, including some sort of fantastic ones. Again, that would probably form more in the psychiatric category today, and we don't see very often, which would like people who would wander. All of a sudden, they'd wander and they couldn't be found. They had these dissociative fugues, and then they'd be brought back, and then they'd wander again. And so there's this very interesting case report, a very famous neurologist who presents the case of this doctor who has these sort of seizures, dreamy seizures, in which he's absent but not really absent during the period of time. And I just thought it's the short mention, but I thought like what a fantastic way of exploring like where we are within ourselves. Like he's there, but he's not there, and so that kind of inspired it. But you're right. I think that and it's a nice observation that a lot of the stories have to deal with sort of a subjective view of the world by the individual, and attempting to kind of reconcile that with science, with reason. And they're usually pretty, in these stories, usually pretty uncomfortable with each other as different people, whether in the later story, a mother brings her son with asthma to see a series of doctors, and they have their diagnoses and they have their prescriptions, but none of them really fit with the experience that the boy is having. And that's definitely the case with this man. Like he's pleading for doctor's help, but I think that we have the sense in reading this that that no one's going to be able to help him out.
Yeah, I think the funniest part in the whole book for me, and from the passages you read, I don't know if it comes across that there are some very funny parts in this collection, but in the story you just mentioned of the mother who brings her son to see the various doctors, she brings him to a series of doctors who all diagnose him as having acute catarrh or whatever. It's like some old timey sounding diagnoses, and then they prescribe bloodletting and vomiting and horrible things. I love how you both bask in the period details and in the voice of how people might have written letters in the 19th century, for example. But you also kind of bask in the benighted scientific ideas of the time. And then, so she's seen the three doctors, and then there's a fourth doctor who comes, who's different, who really seems to care and see things differently. And then, I hope this is not a spoiler, but then at the end he says, "Yeah, it's acute catarrh."
Right.
I recommend bloodletting or whatever. So, is that? I mean, when you are going about when you are on your rounds, do you go on rounds?
I go on rounds, yeah.
Okay. When you're on your rounds, I mean, do you feel like you're one of those doctors prescribing bloodletting? I mean,
no bloodletting. I haven't prescribed bloodletting. I haven't prescribed purging. I haven't prescribed my favorite prescription from this era is application of Spanish fly of these of beetles. Cantharid beetles, which were ground up and then rubbed into a blister or rubbed into an excoriation to create a blister. It's a really old humoral theory, the idea you sort of bring the bad humors to the surface. But they're terrifically vivid in that there's always this description of the doctors are always very excited that they have the good beetle, like you shouldn't get your beetles from this country because they smoke them with vinegar and they turn dull, but really get like the Italian ones where they collect them by hand and they sort of exquisite turquoise.
Wallace, the species man in Borneo or whatever.
Right, who would have sent them back? Yeah. So no, I haven't. I love reading about it, but I've never prescribed cantharides either. I think that I'm sure a lot of doctors feel the same way, that there are moments where you're brought a story and you really do the best that you possibly can to characterize what's going on in the person's life. But at the end of the day, the treatment is really lagging behind diagnosis. And having effective treatment is a pretty modern phenomenon. Like most of the medical history, like people do, there's sort of this high point of like diagnosis, but like actually knowing what to do is like this whole other problem that requires its own set of challenges. And so particularly when these stories take place, it's quite horrible. The options are diet or a few sort of purgings or a few medications, maybe some plants, but that's it. But there's some, but we have much more we can do now. But there's, I think we're always bumping up against the limits of what we understand and what we can do.
So you mentioned that one story was based on a case study from the 19th century. There's a story which begins with a snippet from Herodotus that you then spin about an experiment run by a pharaoh, and then you kind of spin out this whole story of a pharaoh. Again, it's another amateur scientist who
very amateur.
Yeah, who's running his experiments on human nature. What if, you have two babies that one is raised by wolves and one is raised by whatever without anyone ever speaking to it? That one is the form is very clear to the reader. You've started, it's almost like one of those shouts and murmurs pieces in the New Yorker that begins with a clipping and then just sort of plays it out to an absurd extreme. Right. But then it sounds like some of the other ones are kind of implicitly built the same way, that you came across an interesting story about a historical figure or a historical incident, be it Wallace or this country doctor who had whatever it was, epilepsy, and then you use that as a launching point for imagining something. Is it just the three that we've talked about, or other stories in this collection also in that form? Is that a favorite way that you have of starting a story?
I think that's a pretty common way that I'll find that I'll write a story. And I'm aware, since we're talking at the Center for Fiction, that probably a number of people who are listening are writers also. And I think writers are always curious, like, about how other writers work. Like I'm always asking people, like, what do you do? Where do you start? So on this, I'd say, usually like an idea, like there'll be something that draws me in. So for the first story in the book, an image of boxers in the 1830s, bare knuckle fighters, that kind of like just drew me in and got me interested. And then a kind of language, and then I feel like I love a lot of this is like coming across old language that I love, like English that's sort of familiar but not familiar, and words that I kind of know but I don't know, and I love the outsider artist at the end of the book you mentioned is a person who worked with found objects. Like all of his art is collages of found objects. And I think he spoke to me because like I love working with found objects. Like I love old texts. I love old sort of non-fictional texts and working with those. And so usually what happens is I'll find something, I'll love it, I'll think of, I really would love to play with this voice for some while, but there isn't a chance to work on it or a story to connect it to. And then it'll be like several months later or a couple of years later that there's something, usually like a contemporary thing, which I'm interested in, that all of a sudden I realize like this old clothing is something that I can kind of dress it in and get at what I'm trying to be able to get at.
I'm just realizing as you're talking, there's a bunch of collectors in the collection, and you're kind of you almost present the collection as a collection of collectors, like the different, you've got your different specimens arranged of people who are all cataloging and collecting in different ways. I just just now.
It's very nice. Like yeah. I mean, I like thank you for noticing that. I mean, I see them as kind of objects, and the book has images. And I think that one of the reasons the book has these images, which sort of begin as pretty literal and then kind of become a little bit more cryptic as the story goes on, is it's just like in any kind of catalog. You look at like these, like any kind of encyclopedia, and you have your image, and then you have the text that goes along with the image, and so they sort of form this kind of cabinet of curiosities, and so then it ends with a true collector. But no, that's what it feels like, kind of collecting lives.
So we have a few questions from people in the wider world, but just one little question I had, without going into any of the details of what these are. I did notice as I was reading, there's very subtle ways the stories interlink, like little throwaway references, a name mentioned in one that reappears in another in a vastly different context. And just going back to where we started about how the collection was put together, it made me wonder if this was something that you were doing naturally as you went along, kind of building an extended Daniel Mason short literary universe, or if you kind of reverse engineered those little Easter eggs in the collection once the stories were side by side.
A combination, so that there was sometimes there would be something that I'd like, there's like a kind of like a writer's tick that seemed ticky, so it appeared to stories that I might take it out. But then there are others that are put back in. I think with the idea of creating a kind of thread that runs through the story, so that their motifs and so that the connection that occurs to them is not just broadly thematic, but also occurs sort of like a little bit on a little bit more of a granular level. Like one thing I found as time has gone on. And it's far been for me to tell people like how to read a short story collection, but I've noticed like as I read other writers who have collections, that there's something wonderful about kind of reading them in the way that they're written, and I feel like there was this like secret that I wasn't told, that they actually put those stories in a particular order because that's the order they wanted them to be read, and so in this case there is sort of this authorial hand pushing on the scales a little bit to try to make the experience a little bit more of a cohesive one than just stories standing on their own. Now you have, speaking of images, you have actually flickered in and out as we were speaking. But are you there still, Daniel?
I am. I'm still here.
Okay.
Just my ghostly absence, like doctor service. Okay, I'm just looking here. There's a few questions here. So one is just, I guess you were sort of getting at this before, but the intersection of literature, medicine, and science, and the observation that so many physicians become writers. I mean, that's true, more than, I guess, certainly more than writers become physicians. Why is that?
What, more writers become physicians?
No, why do so many doctors become writers? And I guess I mean, there's some, whoops. Yeah. The answer mentions the intersection of science, medicine, and writing, which I also think is sort of an interesting way to think about it, as not just, what is it like to be a doctor and a writer, but what is it like to have those three areas intersecting in some Venn diagram.
Sure. It's funny, your image has not returned to the screen. I love that there's this kind of meta quality to talking on Zoom or CrowdCast or whatever it is nowadays. The cognitive experience has sort of shifted this from a conversation to like a radio interview or like a phone call, that sort of changed its quality, which is it's actually sort of nice. I'm going to try to make eye contact with you, but you're not there, so I'm just looking kind of at myself. There's this little icon representing you. I'll represent. So I apologize for the distraction. For this question, a lot of doctors do become writers. I don't know, statistics, like, the doctor side of me, if we're talking about science side of me wants to say, like, has there been a study that like looks at the prevalence of like doctors who become writers or everybody else who becomes writers? But that's not really, and is it true, or do we just sort of notice it because the field seems so different? I don't know. I know that lots and lots and lots of doctors write, well beyond folks who publish novels, say. I mean, at Stanford we have these groups of writers, and it started from one group and expanded into 5 just to be able to hold the number of people who are writing. Can you hear me still, Daniel?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. So, I think that there's, I guess I felt when I first started out that there was this great discrepancy between sort of the magnitude of human experience that one is privileged, or at times sort of forced to observe just by being with people who are going through these moments that regularly wouldn't encounter outside of medicine. And then you walk out of the hospital, and I just remember first feeling this in medical school, that I'd be with somebody who was dying, and then I would leave and I would meet some friends at a bar, and they'd be talking about what they were doing, and like there was part of me that couldn't understand why they weren't talking about this guy who I'd just been with for the first part of the day. And so there's this disjunction, sort of space opened up, where I like was really sort of needed to think about it or write about it, and I think that probably drives a lot of doctors. Like one has to, in the professional moment, set certain kinds of boundaries, sort of represent a certain sort of voice of rationality, like we kind of talked about, kind of maintain one's role, and then encounter a life and recognize that in that moment you're important to the life, but you're also peripheral in a certain kind of way. And I think that disjunction just like leads one to need to kind of keep talking about it, or need to keep that patient in the room, or keep that family kind of in the room, if only exploring them imaginatively through fiction. So I don't know if that's what drives everybody, but I imagine that drives a lot of people. I've heard that before, and I certainly feel that.
It reminds me, I guess not long after you and I got to be friends, and when I was still in graduate school, I ended up getting into a literature seminar for doctors and medical students and graduate students in the sciences that was taught by Michael Ondaatje. He had come up to the narrative medicine program, and he was teaching this seminar as part of that. And this is just my subjective sense of what was going on in that room, but it really seemed like the doctors and the poet were coming at it from just totally what each group wanted, what we wanted and what he wanted were totally different. Like he wanted something that I certainly couldn't have provided as a basic science graduate student, but like he wanted the doctors to be bringing some true hands-on experience of healing or medicine and dealing with people and something like that. And instead, we all acted like it was, like another literature class in college. And there's just a sense of disappointment around the whole process from beginning to end, and mounting frustration. And I mean, it was a wonderful class, and I was so glad to have taken it. But I felt this sadness in the background, that like this connection between writer and physicians was like failing to live up to what it was supposed to be. That's sad. What a great but sad moment. What an audience though with Michael Ondaatje. Yeah. Okay. Another question: how does writing short stories compare to writing a novel?
So I really like it because again, it's sort of like a chance to play with a voice or play with an idea, and not feel this gigantic thing sitting on my back in the way that I feel like with a novel. I mean, it doesn't always have to be the case with a novel, but speaking as someone who was working on his last novel for 14 years, there's this sort of sense of this presence that enters into one's life and just kind of looms there. And one can be in love with a character or an idea or a kind of language, but there's so much that can go wrong. And I feel like that's certainly the case with a short story. Like 90% of the stories I start, I end up abandoning, probably more than that. But there's much more of a freedom, because at the end of the day, it's not months or years of work, which are going to be thrown out. And I think that sometimes just kind of, that kind of liberates me a bit. So I really like the short form. I feel like a novel, there's something about feeling like you need to say so much in it that puts so much pressure on the book. And with a short story, it's not quite the case. I've been reading Lucia Berlin. I don't know if people have read her Manual for Cleaning Women is the most recent. She's passed away, but it was republished and kind of brought her people's attention. And it's so wonderful. Like, a lot of the stories are just these little vignettes. And I'm so grateful to have been in the presence of those vignettes and these people for just these brief moments of time. And I think, like, how great that she is sharing this. Maybe none of these would have found a place in a novel, but there's still a place for them. So I like these small structures.
I remember you're telling me years and years ago, again, when you were, I think, still working on your first novel, or maybe you just finished it, about how much you love Bruce Chatwin and how influential his work had been on you. And well, it just seems like a sort of a fun opportunity to ask you now, 4 books later, or 5 books. What are we at? 4, 5? Many years later and many books later, if Chatwin is still important to you, and I don't know if it's in the same way or different ways.
Yeah, I haven't read him in a long time. There was a period of time, I think probably right when I started writing this, that I was reading him just constantly and only. and that would have been when we connected at UCSF. And I think that he opened up for me a certain kind of, like, a possibility of the material world in a way that I hadn't really recognized before. I love the voice. So for those who've read Chatwin, he has these very sort of simple sentences. They're incredibly dense. The sort of the legend of Chatwin is that he worked, I forget whether it was for Christie's or for Sotheby's, but he wrote their auction catalog copy, and so he developed the style of needing to describe something, sort of like an exquisite museum item or auction item in as few words as possible. And so it's books are really thin, but every sentence carries this incredible description of the physical world. And so for a long time, I wrote only kind of in that kind of sentence. And I don't think actually any of those stories made it into here. But I think what has endured is just like his intention to things and the power of things to really kind of create not only a physical space, but also kind of emotion or internal space as well. Now that you mentioned, I want to go back and On the Black Hill. I mean, all those books are actually kind of wonderful on a different level, but On the Black Hill is truly sort of an exquisite book.
I guess when I was reading the collection, I imagined you as you're working on each story, reading only, I don't know, letters written by country doctors in 1870, or diary entries by French aeronauts in the late 18th century. How do you get the voice of those different, moments in time and space?
Well, I mean, like you say, I think it's a matter of diet. So I think, like, at the time that I'm writing it, I'll try just to read that style, at least in that moment, and which means I can't read other writers. So there was, like, one of the best parts about finishing The Winter Soldier, this novel that took me so long, is that for years I had put off reading W.G. Sebald, who's like my favorite writer, because his sentences were so influential that, like, all I had to do was literally sort of like open a page of one of his books, and now I find myself stuck writing in his style for the next 2 weeks until the effects sort of wore off. So I kind of banned it from my diet. And then there's this joyful moment, like once The Winter Soldier was done, I realized all of a sudden that I can read him without feeling like I was going to be so easily influenced by him.
Do you get stuck in the voice of French balloonist for a while after the story is complete.
You know, I think the French balloonists aren't quite as eloquent as Sable is, so that the half-life of the influence is a little bit less.
I guess we have a question also about your writing process, very broadly. I'm just thinking of a way to narrow it in our remaining minute of time here.
Right, yeah.
Okay, well, let me just, I'm unable, on the spot, unable to figure out a way to narrow that down. Another question I had was, you know, a lot of the narrators in this book are middle-aged men, I would say, but none of them are, you know, middle-aged men teaching at Stanford in 2020. They're like middle-aged men in vastly different circumstances than you are, and it just made me wonder, from, I guess, in terms of the writing process, like how you've in not certainly not all these stories, but a number of them, you've set up a character who is like you in certain sort of fundamental ways, but then just transposed so completely into, you know, a little shack in the jungle or something. And it just, you know, is having them be sort of like you in some way an important tether that allows you to imagine your way into this extremely different scenario.
A tether is a nice word. I think that often sometimes drives it. So, you know, there's something that's like emotionally pressing that I want to explore, and that's there. And a lot of times if a story gets lost, I'll kind of try to reorient myself with that question, like what was this thing that drove me before. You know, at the same time, like I find the escapist quality of writing quite one of the nicest parts of it. I mean, that's especially true, I think, nowadays, as you know, the contrast between shuttling between the news page and the blank page of what I'm working on is quite striking at times. And so writing serves a purpose both of sort of processing sort of anxieties about the moment, but also being able to step outside of it like a little bit.
Okay, well, I think we're really running to the end. If there's anyone has any final questions they want to type into the question box, do so now. Otherwise, I guess we're ready to wrap up here.
Yeah. CrowdCast, with its machine intelligence, has decided to return you in physical form to my screen. And so I can actually see you now for the first time for some time.
Poor lighting, though. I feel like I'm trying to figure out.
It's gotten darker in New York. It's darker since you reappeared. It's sort of nice. It's a nice fitting. Somehow the computer knows someone's listening. They know that we're at an end. And I see Melanie.
Yes. Yes. So I just wanted to pop back up and thank you both for such a wonderful, rich conversation. Thanks, Daniel, for sharing your work with us. And thanks, Dan, for a great interview. And for those of you who are watching, don't forget to buy Daniel's book by clicking that link right there.
And support the Center of Fiction in doing so.
Yes. Yes. So thank you both so much. And thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. Come back.
All right. Thank you both.